This is Entertainment for Review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the 1999 comedy classic, American Pie. This movie seemed to make a big splash when it came out at the time. Heard a lot of people talking about it, of course. I was only 8 years old when this movie came out, so I didn't see it right away. But it did seem like a movie that needed to be seen, and I heard people, even at my age group, talking about it. I would actually end up seeing the sequel, American Pie 2, before I saw this one, but eventually I would get the opportunity to see this movie in its entirety, which was probably still at a younger age than I should have. This movie would go on to spawn many sequels, 3 sequels in the main storyline, and many other indirect sequels that just happened to fall under the American Pie banner. But today we're going to be taking a look at the one that started it all. Please be aware, if you haven't seen this movie, that this review will contain spoilers. So let's discuss the movie. American Pie is a coming-of-age comedy movie about 4 friends who are coming to the end of their high school experience and are all still virgins. And that fact does seem to bother them all, and so they want to do something about it before the end of senior year. The 4 main characters in this movie are Jim, Kevin, Oz, and Finch. The other character that has to be mentioned, of course, is Steve Stifler, who is one of the almost iconic characters in this series. Although I would argue in this first movie, he is a supporting cast member, although he would rise up to become a main character in the sequels to follow. After a party at Stifler's house, the 4 main characters realize they're all still being virgins, and they don't want to be, so they want to try to do something about that. They also seem discouraged after someone who they deem nerdier than them, Sherman or the Shermanator, seems to have gotten lucky that very night at the party. So they all decide to make a pact in order to all sleep with a girl before senior year, and specifically by prom night.
Really simple. We just gotta make an agreement. Or, no, it's more than an agreement.
What, a bet?
A pact.
Which is 3 weeks from the party that they were at. And thus it gives birth to one of their big quotes for the movie series, which is, "To the next step."
To the next step.
Next step.
Next step.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, some might view this movie as a raunchy comedy, and it does have its moments, but in my opinion, it also shows a lot of personal growth in some of the characters. Now, each of these main characters decides to take a different path forward to try to fulfill this pact that they've made. Let's start with Jim, who can arguably be said is the main character of the series. Jim first decides he's going to try the early stages of online dating. But he does have a particular girl in mind. There's a foreign exchange student at the school named Nadia, and she is the girl that he seems most interested in getting. And we do get the unfortunate scene where Jim does unspeakable acts to a apple pie, which his father walks in upon, and being a pretty cool father, just says, "We'll tell your mother we ate the pie." And we can't understate Jim's dad. He is a very cool character. He tries to give his son awkward sex talks, finds him in all sorts of weird situations, and just kind of rolls with it and tries to give fatherly advice along the way. This is just a start to this character who is one of my favorites. He is a very interesting character going forward in this movie and only gets better as the series continues. Jim finally does get a chance with Nadia when she asks him to tutor her in world history. She arrives at his house and says she needs to change from her ballet clothes in his room. And Jim has taken some very bad advice from Stifler in this scene, in which he is going to put a webcam on so that he and his friends can watch her change. This scene probably doesn't age well because it's a very poor decision and would probably have gotten Jim in a lot more trouble in the modern day. Jim makes a mistake, however, and accidentally sends the link out to everybody in his high school. This scene is always very confusing to me and doesn't make much sense, because not only does Nadia begin to change in Jim's room, but then she decides to lay on his bed naked and begin to pleasure herself while looking at an inappropriate magazine. Something you wouldn't think she would do when she's expected to be dressed and downstairs to study moments later. I guess the argument could be made that she was waiting for Jim to return because she was interested in him, but it just always struck me as a very odd scene. It's the most revealing scene in the movie, and I guess they had to get one in there. Luckily, this movie doesn't go overboard with that, in my opinion, which is what makes it actually a pretty decent movie as opposed to just a raunchy teen comedy. At his friend's encouragement, Jim does return to his room and attempt to sleep with Nadia, but he unfortunately has some performance issues. And after this event being broadcasted over the internet, we find out that Nadia is sent back to her home country. So Jim has been humiliated in front of his entire school. He doesn't think he has any hopes now, and enter Michelle.
Because this one time at band camp...
What's your...
Michelle is a band geek, and he doesn't believe that she saw what happened, so he asks her to prom, and she accepts. Michelle is another character who is a bit minor in this movie, but does of course go on to again become one of the more major main characters in future movies. She's portrayed in most of his movies as a nerdy band girl, and even gets rejected from going to Stifler's party when her and some band friends try to enter. So they get to prom, and Jim seems down on himself and not too happy to be there with Michelle, although he does it. He even gets to a point where he says he is so nervous about sex and he hasn't even had it yet. So he says he hates it. This would, I guess, be his moment of personal growth in the movie, although he doesn't show as much growth as some of the other characters, I would think. After prom, they're at Stifler's next party, and he's talking with Michelle, and then she starts to tell some stories that are a little bit more risky in nature, and then she flat out asks him if they're going to sleep together, and he says, let's do it. They go find a room, and they do. Michelle's portrayed then as a much more aggressive and sexual person to contrast her earlier character. And Jim is all about it, so he does complete the pact. In order of what they show in the movie, he's the third one to complete the pact. And it is notable that when he wakes up the next morning, Michelle has ditched him, leaving him alone at Stifler's house, and he seems pretty pleased with the fact that he's been used. So still a little bit of immaturity there, of course. Next, I'd like to take a look at Kevin. Kevin is the only one at the beginning of this movie who has a high school girlfriend. Oz seems to have a girlfriend at the beginning, but it's a college girl, and she's only in one scene, and we never see her again. Probably because after the interaction with Oz in a car, she deems him to be a little bit immature. So Kevin is dating Vicky. They have not slept together yet, although they have had some physicality together. They both seem unready to move to that next physical step, and for different reasons. Vicky is ready to move their relationship also to the next emotional level, and she wants to tell him that she loves him and wants him to say it in return. Kevin is very nervous about taking this step because he's not sure if he feels that way. And it is worth noting that Kevin is also the one who proposes the pact in the first place, because he seems nervous about taking this next step without his friends. Kevin is also portrayed as a bit sex-obsessed. He wants to move forward physically, but he doesn't feel ready to move forward emotionally. Probably one of Kevin's key scenes is when he calls his brother for some advice, and his brother tells him where he can find the Love Bible hidden in the school, basically a sex manual handed down from generation to generation at this high school. Him and Vicky go back and forth and have their up and downs throughout the movie, but they do finally decide to sleep together on prom night. Now, Kevin at prom is trying to look for an update from the other guys who have all told him basically he needs to be able to do this on his own, and they'll figure it out on their own. Kevin is pretty upset in this scene because he is now worried about taking the next step because he doesn't know how he truly feels emotionally. And the guys do manage to encourage him to go to the after prom party by telling him that they found out that Sherman had not really slept with the girl at the party at the beginning, a fact that she announces to the entire gym, leaving Sherman standing there and wetting his pants, showing that lying doesn't pay. At the party, him and Vicky do indeed sleep together. They are the first ones shown to fulfill this pact, although Vicky made him say I love you first, which he finally does, and hopefully this was genuine. The next morning, when they're waking up and talking, she basically says she doesn't think that their relationship's going to work when they go to different colleges in the fall. He says he thinks it can work, but basically also agrees that they are going to be in different places, alone, meeting different people. He says he meant what he said the night before, and she said she knows. Up until this point, I would have thought that Kevin had shown the least growth in the movie. He just seems more obsessed with the pact, but I would say he does grow a little bit in his relationship with Vicky here. Next, I'd like to take a look at Finch. Finch would be probably the nerdiest in the group, so he has a very different strategy to try to attract a date for the prom. He decides to pay a girl who we find out is Jessica, the best friend of Vicky, to spread some rumors about his sexual ability and other random facts that will make other women interested in him. And it does appear to be working, up until things get pushed a little too far, in which a lie was told that he had beaten up Stifler, and Stifler decides to take some revenge. He calls Finch shitbreak because Finch leaves school every day to use the bathroom at home. So Stifler puts some laxative in Finch's drink, and this leads to Finch needing to use the bathroom at school. He unfortunately gets tricked into going into the girls' bathroom, and when 3 girls come in and are talking at the sinks, he can't hold it in anymore and has to relieve himself in violent fashion. So Finch is humiliated and his plans seem to be falling apart. He's the only one to go to prom without a date. He receives a gift from Jessica in apology for their plan not really working, although she does very clearly tell him that he's not going to be hooking up with her. Finch does finally find his success at Stifler's after party, and the disturbing part is that he finds it with Stifler's mom, who in this movie has been labeled as a MILF, and for some odd reason his attempts work and he does sleep with Stifler's mother and fulfills his end of the pact as well. And Stifler finds them in the morning and passes out in shock. The last one in the group to discuss is Oz. Now, I saved Oz for last because I feel like by far he is the one in the group who matures the most throughout this movie. After striking out with his college girlfriend at the beginning of the movie, Oz decides to try his own method after the party and the pact. His method is to join the jazz choir. At first, this seems just to try to hit on what he calls an untapped market of the pretty girls that are in the jazz choir. But it does very quickly become evident that he is developing feelings for one girl in particular in the choir, and that is Heather, and that he is also starting to enjoy being in jazz choir. There is a scene where they hit a rough patch where Heather thinks that he is making fun of her with the other jock because of Stifler. But he does manage to mend the fences, and their relationship does progress forward successfully. Oz does hit a major stumbling block when he realizes that his final lacrosse game of the season falls on the same day as a big jazz group performance where he's supposed to be performing a duet with Heather. He tells her he can't make it, and she understands, so he goes to play his game. But after having some distraction at the game and a speech from his coach, he realizes that that's not the most important place for him to be at the moment, and leaves the game and goes and performs with Heather. He goes to prom and even tells Kevin that he's not worried about this pact. And at the after party, him and Heather are together, and he even tells Heather about the pact. She doesn't seem to like it, but also doesn't become overly offended because he does manage to explain himself pretty well and say that's not what he's worried about. Him and Heather do also sleep together this night, so he does complete the pact, but for him it's not about the pact, it's about the feelings he has for Heather. And the reason I think he's matured the most is because when they've all gathered at the end of the movie, he doesn't tell his friends that he slept with Heather, he just says that they had a wonderful night together. And Kevin and Jim seem to think that he didn't. So Oz didn't kiss and tell, which is a very mature method. And he even says that he thinks that him and Heather are falling in love together. The Oz character was very interesting in this movie, and I actually could have seen the series going forward with him in the focus, but as we know, Jim does stay in the focus in the future movies. And the movie does end with the four gathered again at a restaurant, and they again tell each other to the next step.
Here's to the next step.
To the next step.
To the next step. To the next step.
This time not meaning sleeping with a girl, meaning completing high school and moving on to the next stage of life. This movie is a very strong comedy performance and a very character-driven performance, and I find this to be a very good movie in my opinion. I like watching the growth of the characters, the friendship, the relationships, and just the characters realizing that it's time to move on to the next stage of life, and it's more about that than having sex. Without the pie scene and the webcam scene, I might see this movie being looked at in a different light than what it is. Not to say that this movie isn't looked at well, because I do think this is one of the teen comedies of a generation. In that meaning that a whole generation of teens probably identify with this movie and its sequels. Always to specify the main sequels, the 3 sequels that follow this movie, not the other spin-off sequels that are out there. Reception for this movie, I was a little surprised, a little lower than I would have thought. On Rotten Tomatoes, this movie received a 61% fresh score from critics and an equal score of 61% from audiences. On IMDb, it gets a little bit of a higher score with a 7.0 out of 10. Personally, I score this movie a little higher at around an 8 out of 10. It's a movie I still enjoy watching to this day and still gives me a good laugh every time. Let me know your thoughts on this movie in the comments section below. Who are your favorite characters in this series? Are there any scenes that you like that I left out? Or just give your thoughts on the movie in general. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and keep an eye out for my next video coming soon.